Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into the world of harm reduction. At nightlife events and festivals, all those places where the music's thumping and the energy's high. Someone sent us a really in-depth study on this. It analyzes all sorts of different approaches to minimizing the risks. Those risks that come with alcohol and drug use at these events. I'm so ready to unpack this. We're talking about everything, from changing those closing times to giving out free water, even looking at those drug-sniffing dogs. So get ready. This is going to be fascinating.
What really strikes me is just how massive this study is. It covers 100 different research papers, all published between 2010 and 2021. It gives us a really solid overview of what people have tried and what's been tested for over a decade. It shows a real commitment to figuring out how to make these events safer.
It's incredible to see so much research going into this. One thing that jumped out at me while I was reading through it was the focus on those traditional nightlife spots, like your bars and clubs. It seemed like only a small chunk of the studies actually looked at those big outdoor music festivals. It feels like we've got a lot more to learn about harm reduction, especially in those massive open-air events.
You've hit the nail on the head there. As festivals have become more and more popular, the research is trying to keep up, to understand the unique challenges they bring. It's a constantly changing landscape.
Okay, so let's get down to it.
Right.
What actually works when it comes to reducing harm? The authors of this study found that the most promising results came from interventions, the ones that use multiple strategies all at the same time. They call these multi-component interventions, which might sound a bit jargony, but it's a pretty simple idea when you think about it.
It is. Instead of just relying on one thing, like just changing when things close, these multi-component approaches use a bunch of strategies together. They all work together. It's like creating a safety net, but with lots of layers.
That makes sense. It reminds me of those lockout laws they put in place in Sydney, Australia. Wasn't that a good example of this multi-component thing in action?
Absolutely. Those lockout laws, they were introduced back in 2014. They said venues had to lock their doors at 1:30 a.m. so no one else could get in after that. And then the last call for alcohol was 3 a.m. Plus, they did a bunch of other stuff too, like increasing police presence and putting limits on certain kinds of drinks.
But didn't those lockout laws cause a bit of an uproar? I remember there being a ton of debate about how they affected things.
Yeah, they were definitely controversial. And that brings up a really important point about harm reduction. There's rarely a simple solution. The Sydney lockout laws, well, they sparked a huge debate about the impact on nightlife in the city and the economy and people's freedom to just have a good time. It's a complicated issue. There are no easy answers.
It seems like finding the right balance is key. The study did say that those Sydney lockout laws, well, they led to a pretty big drop in assault, so there were some positive outcomes. But it sounds like there were also some complex social and economic things to think about.
Exactly. It's a matter of weighing the good against the bad. And we also have to remember, the research on those lockout laws is still going on. Some studies are saying that while assaults might have gone down in some spots, they might have actually increased in nearby areas. So the full picture is still up for debate.
It's pretty wild how something that seems straightforward at first can end up having these ripple effects that are so intricate. This is turning out to be a pretty thought-provoking deep dive.
It really is, and we're just getting started. There's so much more to dig into when it comes to specific strategies and how they work in different places.
Let's move on to another thing that really caught my attention: on-site medical services at festivals. The research suggests they're incredibly effective at reducing the number of people who need an ambulance to go to the hospital. Some cases showed a decrease of up to 78%.
You're right. It just goes to show how important it is to have trained medical people right there on the spot, ready to respond to any emergency. It's a crucial safety net. That can make a world of difference when it really matters.
Absolutely. And what about drug checking, sometimes called pill testing? It lets people have their drugs analyzed so they know what they're actually taking. The review highlighted a UK festival. They saw a 95% reduction in people going to the hospital for drug-related reasons after they started offering drug checking. That's a pretty impressive result.
It is, and it shows how powerful harm reduction strategies can be, especially the ones that focus on giving people accurate information so they can make informed choices. Of course, drug checking is still a hot topic, but those findings are hard to dismiss.
Now let's talk about those drug-sniffing dogs. I've always wondered if they actually make a difference. Do they really discourage drug use, or is there more to it?
Get ready for a surprise. The research is saying that drug-sniffing dogs, well, they might actually be making things worse.
Oh, that's not what I was expecting at all.
A few studies found that people are more likely to do risky things, like hiding drugs internally, or taking all of their drugs at once. just so they don't get caught. And this panic consumption, well, it can lead to overdoses and other health problems. So those drug-sniffing dogs, they might actually be making the very problems they're supposed to solve even worse.
That's a pretty eye-opening thought. It seems like going with our gut feeling can sometimes steer us in the wrong direction. It's so important to have solid research to really understand the true impact of these things.
You're absolutely right, and that's what makes this deep dive so valuable. We're really digging into the evidence to find out what really works and what might actually be doing more harm than good.
So far, we've uncovered some really valuable insights about just how complex harm reduction can be. It's clear that there are no easy answers, and even when we have good intentions, we can still end up with unintended consequences.
Exactly. And that's why it's essential to take a multi-pronged approach, one that considers the unique features of each setting and the diverse needs of the people attending those events.
I'm ready to go deeper into those multi-component interventions and explore some concrete examples from around the globe. What lessons can we learn from how they were put into action and from the debates they sparked?
I'm excited to dive into those case studies too. It's a chance to really understand the finer points of each approach and see how they could be adapted to different contexts.
Let's start with those controversial Sydney lockout laws. They provide a fascinating case study with effects that reach far and wide, both positive and negative. Let's unpack what we can learn from them and from all the passionate debate that surrounded them.
The Sydney lockout laws are a perfect example of just how tangled up these issues can get. They did lead to a pretty noticeable drop in assaults, but we have to look deeper to understand the bigger picture.
So fewer assaults is a good thing, but what were some of those unintended consequences you talked about?
Well, as you can imagine, there was some pushback from a lot of different groups, businesses in those areas. They argued that the lockouts kind of killed the vibe of Sydney's nightlife and that it hurt their profits. Then you had residents. They were worried about noise and safety issues and whether those problems were just moving to residential areas. And of course, some people felt like the lockouts were stepping on their freedom, their freedom to enjoy a night out.
It sounds like a classic case of trying to balance public safety with individual rights and the economy. And then there's that research you mentioned about violence being displaced. That adds another layer of complexity to it all.
Exactly. It's not a simple equation. Some studies suggest that assaults might have gone up in areas right next to the ones affected by the lockouts, but other studies haven't found clear evidence of that. Figuring out how to measure displacement accurately is tricky. The debate is still going strong.
It just goes to show that even when we're trying to do the right thing, we can end up with unexpected outcomes. So, moving beyond Sydney, what are some other examples of these multi-component interventions? The study mentions some similar initiatives in other parts of Australia, like Queensland and Newcastle.
Yeah. Queensland put in place a policy called Tackling Alcohol-Fueled Violence, or TAFV for short. It had a whole bunch of measures. They limited the hours when you could buy alcohol in certain high-risk entertainment areas, no shots after a certain time, and they brought in mandatory ID scanners at entrances.
Sounds pretty comprehensive. What were the results of that policy?
The research suggests that the TAFV policy did work. It reduced a number of negative outcomes, like assaults, hospitalizations, and ambulance calls. But just like in Sydney, there were worries about potential displacement of violence, and some businesses pushed back. They said it was hurting their operations.
It seems like striking that balance between keeping people safe and considering the economic and social sides of nightlife is a recurring theme.
It's definitely a challenge that keeps coming up. And that's what makes the Newcastle example so interesting. They combined a few strategies: earlier closing times, a lockout period, and limits on serving shots after a certain time.
So a mix of approaches we've heard before. How did things turn out in Newcastle?
The results were pretty impressive. Newcastle saw some major long-term drops in both assaults recorded by the police and alcohol-related injuries. What's really insightful is that when researchers compared Newcastle to a control site, they found that cutting back on trading hours made a bigger difference than the lockout in achieving those positive outcomes.
So that suggests that just limiting the hours when alcohol is easy to get can be a really effective way to reduce harm?
It seems that way. Yeah. But it's super important to remember the context matters. What works in Newcastle might not be as effective in another city, somewhere with different cultural norms, demographics, and nightlife patterns. Every place needs a tailored approach, one that fits its own unique circumstances.
Makes sense. It's about understanding the nuances of each environment. So far, our deep dive has been pretty focused on Australia. What about other parts of the world? the study also talked about interventions in places like the US, New Zealand, the UK, and even some Nordic countries.
Each region brings its own unique perspective and approaches to the table. I think the UK's cumulative impact zones are worth highlighting. These are areas within entertainment districts where local authorities can put stricter rules in place to tackle alcohol-related harm.
So it's a more targeted approach, zeroing in on specific areas where problems are more common.
Exactly. And the research shows that it can be effective. Studies have found a link between these cumulative impact zones and fewer alcohol-related hospital admissions, and even a decrease in crime rates, including violent crimes and sexual assaults. They're not a magic bullet, but they show that focusing interventions on specific locations where they're most needed can be a good strategy.
It's fascinating to see how different countries are trying different things. But we've mostly talked about interventions aimed at reducing alcohol-related harm. What about illicit drug use at festivals and nightlife spots? What does the research tell us about tackling those challenges?
That's where things get even more complicated and often more controversial. The study we're looking at pointed to some promising findings related to drug checking services. As we touched on earlier, these services let people get their drugs tested so they can make more informed decisions about using them.
You mentioned earlier that a UK festival saw a 95% drop in drug-related hospital visits. After they started offering drug checking, that's a pretty amazing result.
It is. But it's important to acknowledge that drug checking is still a very debated topic. Some people argue that it's basically saying it's okay to use drugs, or even encouraging it. Others see it as a practical harm reduction strategy, one that can actually save lives. It's a complex issue that needs careful thought and more research.
It sounds like there are strong arguments on both sides. Besides drug checking, were there any other interesting findings about harm reduction strategies for drug use in these settings?
The study looked at a few other interventions. One that caught my eye was the idea of chill-out spaces, or safe spaces at festivals. These are designated areas where people can go if they're feeling overwhelmed or anxious, or just need a break from all the stimulation.
Those sound like valuable resources, especially for people who might be having a tough time. Did the research say anything about whether these spaces are effective?
The findings were kind of mixed. Some studies showed positive results, like reduced aggression and people being better able to handle difficult experiences. But other studies didn't find any statistically significant impact. It's possible that how well these spaces work depends on things like how they're designed and staffed, and how well they're integrated into the whole event environment.
It seems like the success of these interventions often comes down to the specifics of how they're implemented and the bigger context. Maybe chill-out spaces work better when they're combined with other harm reduction strategies.
That's a good point. It reinforces the idea that a multifaceted approach is often the most effective way to deal with drug-related harm in nightlife and festival settings. There's no single solution that's going to work everywhere.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening. It shed light on the challenges and complexities of harm reduction. It's clear that there aren't any easy answers. And even when we're trying our best, things can still have unintended consequences.
Absolutely. But that doesn't mean we should just give up on finding solutions. The research shows that interventions that are well-designed and carefully put into practice can make a real difference, reducing risks and promoting well-being.
As we wrap up this part of our exploration, what key takeaways would you say our listeners should keep in mind?
I think the most important thing to remember is that harm reduction isn't about trying to stop people from using alcohol and drugs altogether. It's about recognizing that these behaviors exist and focusing on how to minimize the potential downsides while promoting safety and well-being. We've seen that multi-component interventions, the ones tailored to specific contexts, tend to be the most effective, and that ongoing research and evaluation are crucial to make sure these strategies are actually working and that they're adapting to changing needs.
And let's not forget how important it is to think about those unintended consequences. Sometimes our best intentions can lead to unexpected outcomes. Being aware of those potential pitfalls and staying flexible in our approach is really key.
I totally agree. It's about approaching this issue with nuance and humility, and being willing to learn and adapt as we go.
Now, as we head into the final part of our deep dive, I want to leave our listener with a question to think about. What would an ideal, multifaceted harm reduction strategy look like? For your favorite festival or nightlife spot, what would you include in it? And how would it find that balance between keeping people safe and preserving the freedom and enjoyment that make these events so special?
That's a really great question to think about. It makes you really stop and think about how we can make these events as safe and fun as they can be, like we've been talking about. Harm reduction is about finding that sweet spot where we minimize the risks, but don't take away the fun and freedom that people are looking for.
Exactly. It's a tough balance to strike, and there's no one-size-fits-all answer, but we can start to picture what an ideal harm reduction strategy might look like if we look at the research and learn from what's worked in other places.
So let's try to do that. If we were putting together a harm reduction dream team, who are the essential players we'd want on our side? Based on what we've learned so far, I'd say having medical services right there at the event is a must. Having those trained medical pros on hand to deal with emergencies can make a huge difference. It's about being ready for those worst-case scenarios and having that safety net there.
We've seen how effective those services can be at festivals. They really take the pressure off ambulance services and make sure people get the medical help they need quickly. What else would you prioritize besides having medical personnel there?
I think we need to pay attention to the physical environment too, making sure spaces are well lit and well ventilated, and that people have easy access to free water. That can go a long way in preventing things like dehydration and heat stroke, which are big concerns, especially at those outdoor events.
It's amazing how much of a difference those simple things can make. We often forget how important a well-designed space can be. What about the social and cultural side of harm reduction?
That's a really important part of it all. We need to create a culture of responsible behavior, a sense of community where people feel supported and like they can make safe choices. Think about things like peer support networks, clear messaging about consent and treating each other with respect, even designated driver programs.
It sounds like a holistic approach, tackling the issue from different angles. I'm also curious about the role technology can play in all of this.
Technology has a lot of potential when it comes to harm reduction. Imagine apps that give you real-time info, like wait times for services, how crowded different areas are, or even a way to report concerns or incidents anonymously. These tools can empower people with information and connect them with help if they need it.
That makes a lot of sense, using technology to improve communication, provide resources, and create an environment that's more responsive and supportive.
Exactly, and we can use data to understand trends and patterns, so we can keep refining and improving those harm reduction strategies.
This deep dive has been so eye-opening. We've really gone deep into the complexities of harm reduction, explored what's worked and what hasn't, and highlighted the importance of research and adapting as we go.
It's been a really fascinating exploration, and I think the biggest takeaway is that there's no single answer. But if we take a multifaceted approach, use strategies that are backed by evidence, and build a culture of care and responsibility, we can create experiences that are safer and more enjoyable for everyone.
So next time you're heading out to a festival or a night out, think about what we've talked about today. Remember those essential elements: on-site medical services, a supportive environment, clear communication, and using technology in smart ways. Most importantly, have fun, be responsible, and look out for each other.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Have a great time, stay safe, and keep those harm reduction tips in mind.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time for another exciting exploration.